The Battle of the Somme was not a war of men, it was a war of the earth. By the summer of 1916, the British Army was no longer fighting just the Germans. They were fighting a landscape that had been chewed into a literal hell of knee-deep slime, unexploded iron, and the stench of 100,000 unburied sons. But you haven't been told the true story of the Ghost Battalion of the 10th Service, a story that remains one of the most chilling, verified accounts of mass psychological breaking in military history. This is the story of what happens when the human mind is pushed past the point of no return. The date was July 1st, 1916, 7:30 a.m. A whistle blew that would signal the bloodiest day in the history of the British Empire. 60,000 men fell in a single afternoon. Among them was Sergeant Thomas Thorne, a coal miner from Durham who had spent his life in the dark and now found himself blinded by the flashes of the big push. But the horror didn't happen during the charge. It happened 3 days later, in the silence of the sap. Thorne and a remnant of 22 men had become cut off in a shallow trencher sap that extended out into no man's land. They were surrounded by a wall of fog and the relentless, rhythmic thud of German 5.9-inch howitzers. For 72 hours, they had no water. They had no sleep. They were breathing the vaporized remains of their own comrades. Around 2 a.m. on the 4th night, the shelling stopped. The silence was physical. It pressed against their eardrums like a weight. That was when the vibrations began. Thorne recorded in his diary later, recovered from a mud-clogged pocket, that the earth began to hum. It wasn't the hum of machinery. It was the sound of thousands of voices, whispering from beneath the mud. "Sarge," whispered Private B. Wilkes, a boy who had lied about his age to join. "They're calling us. My mother. She's under the fire step." Thorne grabbed the boy, but Wilkes's eyes were blown wide, his pupils like pinpricks. One by one, the men of the 10th began to stand up. They weren't looking at the German lines. They were looking down at their boots. The deprivation, the concussive force of the shells, and the sheer atmospheric pressure had induced a collective, waking nightmare. "They're reaching up," another soldier cried out, clawing at the muddy walls of the trench. "The boys from the first day. They're pulling us in." What followed was a documented phenomenon of the Somme fugue. In their delirious state, the men began to experience the same tactile hallucination, that the ground was no longer solid, but a liquid mass of reaching hands. Thorne tried to maintain order, but the humming grew into a roar in their ears. It was the sound of the earth settling, the shifting of thousands of tons of wet clay. But to men who had seen the world end, it was the sound of the dead reclaiming the living, without a word of command. The 22 men did the unthinkable. They didn't climb out to charge the enemy. They began to dig. They dug with their fingernails, their bayonets, and their helmets. They weren't digging a trench. They were trying to dig their way out of the world. When a relief party from the Royal Warwickshires finally reached the sector 2 hours later, they found a scene that silenced even the most hardened veterans. The trench was empty of life, but the floor was a chaotic mess of deep, jagged holes. The men were found nearly half buried in the mud they had excavated. Their fingers bled white, staring into the dark with the 1,000-yard stare. They hadn't been hit by gas. They hadn't been raided. They had simply been broken by the silence. But the real hook, the part the Ministry of War tried to bury, came weeks later during the medical examinations. All 22 survivors reported the exact same detail, a specific, rhythmic tapping that came from deep within the chalk layers of the Somme. They claimed it was a code. Military intelligence initially dismissed it as tunnelers, neurosis, the fear of German sappers digging mines beneath them. However, when the engineers actually went down into those fugue holes to fill them, They found something that stopped their hearts. 6 feet beneath the floor of the trench where Thorne's men had been digging, they found a forgotten, ancient Roman catacomb that had been collapsed for centuries. Inside were the remains of a legion, trapped by a landslide 2,000 years prior. The British soldiers had been digging directly toward them. How did 22 starving, shell-shocked men, with no knowledge of archaeology or the terrain's history, know exactly where the dead were buried? How did they hear the whispers of a legion through 6 feet of solid French clay? The official report blamed auditory hypersensitivity due to prolonged exposure to high explosives. But Sergeant Thorne, before he was sent to an asylum in Netley, told his nurse a different story. He said the war didn't just kill men, it tore a hole in the fabric between the now and the then. He said that when enough blood is spilled on the same patch of earth, the ground loses its memory of time. Today, the fields of the Somme are quiet. Farmers still plough up the iron harvest, tons of unexploded shells every year. But they also plough up bones. And if you stand in the middle of those fields when the wind dies down and the fog rolls in from the North Sea, you might feel a slight tremor beneath your sawless. It isn't a train. It isn't a truck. It is the earth, still vibrating from the trauma of 1916, humming the song of the millions who are still down there, waiting for someone else to hear the silence. The history of war isn't found in books. It is written in the soil. And the soil never forgets a single drop of blood. If you listen close enough, you'll realize the Great War never truly ended. It just went underground. The question is, are you brave enough to listen? Or are you afraid of what you might hear digging back?